This conference will now be recorded.
Table 4 and 99. Oh, yes, that's correct. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention we are recording this to put on our NS website. So just to let you know, so that if you don't wish to speak and be recording, you can type in the chat box. Okay, so we will be first beginning with talking about tables 4 and table 99, the new changes. And then we're going to focus more specifically on the table 4 related changes, which have to do with MSG. What I'll do is then give a review of definitions of MSG, and this particularly focusing on the relevant ones, the new relevant ones we're allowing for table 4. We'll also talk about data validation requirements, which are also from NRS Octa guidance, both the definition and the validation from guidance. And I'm just going to do a review of those. But then, of course, the key to making this all work is how you implement it and how you do it. And there's some complexities with the different types of MSG. They're not all uniform. They don't all apply equally to all types of MSG. So we will focus on that. And then we're going to hear from Marilyn Pizzulo from Indiana, who will talk about her approach as one example of a way to address some of the MSG. And at the end, we'll have some final question and sharing opportunities. But as I said, please feel free to ask your questions as you wish in the chat box if you don't want to wait. And also, please, again, make sure you're muted, because it's quite distracting. We have 128 people on, so it would be very helpful if you remain muted and off video, unless you're speaking specifically. Okay, so thank you. Let's get started with the table changes. So we'll move to the next slide. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so there are two specific changes that have been made to the tables. This is the most significant one being table 4 and relatedly to table 4C, which is for the distance learners. So what was added there were new columns were allowed for reporting of additional MSG types for workplace literacy and participants in IET programs. So these two new columns are specifically and only for those type of learners. And these were added recently in response to the information collection request public comments, what's called the ICR. The ICR was closed in December, and there were many comments, and this was one change that was made. One of the changes that was made in response to those comments was the change that you're about to see on table 4. We also added a table 99. And this is a new table. It is an internal table. It won't be published, and it's not for the general release. It is for reporting denominators of the indicators on the state performance report. And it's done for accuracy and validity. So let's take a look at the new table 4. To the next slide, please. First, before we do that, I want to remind you of the different types of MSG and what the three new ones are we're allowing for IET and workforce. So we're familiar with educational functioning level gain, of course, which you can do in 3 ways through a pre and post testing and Carnegie units for adult high schools and entry into post-secondary. And of course, we also include a secondary diploma, receipt of a secondary diploma for counting as MSG. So the other 3 are now allowed for workplace literacy and IET, and this is IET participants. This is transcripts, progress toward milestones, and passing the occupational exams, or making progress toward achieving those skills. So in the next slide, we'll see the way you report this is for MSG, for IET and workplace literacy students, you can report the most recent single MSG outcome for these participants other than the EFL gain or receipt of secondary credentials. So you can still use these types of MSG gain for those participants, but if they've achieved one of the other three, most recently in their period of participation, you report them in column G for the first POP and column N for the subsequent POPs, if there are any. 4C is the identical table as you're probably familiar with. It's just for distance learners. So you'll be starting to report this new table. You can use it right now if you want for your 2021 reporting. That is optional. But beginning next program year for the report due in October 1st, 2022, it will be a required table. So the table looks relatively simple, relatively as far as the addition goes. If you look at the next slide, Mehek. Here's I've highlighted in blue the two new columns. So the column G on the left is for recording the additional MSGs received for those two types of participants, workplace literacy and IET, reported in column G by level. And for subsequent ones, you record subsequent POPs reported in column N on the right. Okay, so that's table 4 and also 4C. And the next slide. Okay, now we have table 99, and as I mentioned, that is a administrative table. It's created to allow us to calculate the rates using the denominators that you use when you report them. It's really for internal use. And Octave is modifying the data entry screen so that you will enter in with those yellow columns, and you will no longer enter data in the rate column. And that use of this table will begin this year. And I'm going to ask Jay Lemaster from Octave to expand a little bit on this table, why we have it and how it will work and its implementation. So Jay, if you want to unmute yourself and go on video.
Yep, I've done that. So let's look at the next slide. We can get a little close-up view of the table. So this is the statewide performance report, and what we've been doing over the past several years is we've been entering in the numbers into the column. The columns to the right of those yellow shaded columns have the word NUM, or the abbreviation for number, at the top, and we've been entering into the gray shaded rate column. And what we found is, just very briefly, that at the statewide level, if we had an employment rate in the second quarter that was a certain percentage, and we looked below at something like just the male and female categories, we might have seen in the past occasionally where the percentages for the male-female are not consistent with the statewide percentage. And really, it was because we were having to, because we didn't have the denominator, you weren't reporting that to us, we had to back into it, so to speak, through some calculations in the background of our data system. And it still wasn't, and when we were doing that, it was yielding percentages that weren't exactly consistent with the overall statewide. And so what we're doing here is we're no longer asking you to enter in data in the gray shaded column, so no more rates. We'll calculate that automatically. And what we're doing is shifting the data entry over into a different column for denominator. So for each one of these categories, you're entering the denominator and the numerator. And then our system is that you're entering the denominator, which is new this fall in the yellow columns. And as you did before, you're entering in the numerator. And then what's new this fall is our system will automatically calculate the rate in the gray shaded column. So this is going to be only visible on the edit side of the form. When you click over to the view side, the denominator column will disappear, and all you'll see is the number and the rate. And that is what we will publish, as we have in the past, on the statewide performance report. So this screen, again, only visible on the edit side of the statewide performance report. And as Larry mentioned, we're not, table 99 is not going to be by itself. It's really a vehicle through which we will collect the denominators, and we'll get more accurate rates and more accurate percentages on this particular table. I guess we're ready to go to the next slide. And I see there's questions in the chat, and we'll go ahead and answer those when we're at that point. What do you think, Larry? Or do we want to take care of them now?
I think we just have two questions. One from Brian, who said, who asked, if you're reporting in column G in table 4, does the MSG have to be earned later than another? I'm assuming it's another EFL or MSG type.
Yes, so that policy that continues to apply. You want to answer that? Go ahead, Larry.
Go ahead, Jay. I think go ahead and answer.
So I think what you're asking, Brian, is does the policy still apply that on table 4, you're always reporting the most recent measurable skill gain? And the answer is yes. So for example, in an IET situation, if the most recent measurable skill gain is a high school diploma, that is the measurable skill gain you would report in column G. And so that continues to be the case. I'm sorry, not column G, in column, I don't have the column in front of me, but it would be in the column on table 4 that pertains to attainment of a high school diploma. So it's always the most recent. And so, for example, if a progress report were the most recent measurable skill gain, then you would report that in the new column G. So that still applies. And then Terry Tackett asks, so the new MSG, do we report those for all IET and workplace literacy, and only if they didn't complete the basic original MSGs? Again, Terry, it's the most recent measurable skill gain, and the option here is on table 4. We're not looking at table 4 right now. Can we go back to that briefly, Mehak? Back to table 4. There we go. So we've added 2 new columns to table 4, column G and column N, and we're just really focusing here on column G, which pertains to the first period of participation. It helps us to focus this better. We're using column G to report those additional types of measurable skill gain that could be achieved by participants in an integrated education and training program or in a workplace literacy program. But we're only using it when it's the most recent measurable skill gain. So it's still the way the table is set up, the way the Office of Management and Budget has approved this table for us is to use this table to report the most, and that is what's currently now in joint guidance, to report the most recent measurable skill gain, and that would be those columns E, F, and G. So again, back to that question that Brian asked, if the most recent skill gain is the attainment of a high school diploma, then you would use column F, and even if they had a progress report, but that was before the high school diploma in that same period of participation, because we can only report one measurable skill gain in each period of participation, and it's the most recent one. So that policy, the way this table, so that has not changed on this table. So it's always the most recent one. I hope that answers your question. Lou Sager says, does table 99 replace the statewide summary report? It doesn't replace any report. It's a vehicle. It's a vehicle by which we're going to collect the denominators on the edit side of the table. So it doesn't replace any reports. It's not going to be published, but we did need to identify it as a table in our information collection. We couldn't just change the edit side of the form and start collecting the denominators, even though we were not asking you to enter in the rate column anymore. We couldn't do that without saying, without calling this out as a table in the information collection, even though it's embedded in the statewide performance report on the edit side. Brian says we answered his question. Tina White has a question. And thank you, Terry, for confirming that we answered your question. Regarding IET MSG post-secondary transcript. Now, I would like to pause on these questions, Larry, so that we can get through. Let's come back to Tina's question once we've heard, we've finished our part, and once Marilyn has had an opportunity to present her.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
So we'll hold on, Tina, we'll hold on your question. We'll come back to it.
Great. Okay, so let's move ahead now, back to where we were. What I'm going to do now is just review the definitions of MSG and then the guidance on validation. And these are from, this information you're getting is directly from either Program Memorandum 17.2 or 19.1. And both of these are accessible online, either through the Octave website or the NRS website. At the appendix of the TA guide has links to all the program memorandum. So briefly review those as our next item here. So the next slide here, we see I'm focusing on definitions 3, 4, and 5 here, which are receiving a post-secondary transcript, progress toward milestones, or passage of a occupational exam, or demonstrating progress toward attaining technical and occupational skills. So these definitions are from, as I say, Program Memorandum 17.2. So they they describe, here's a summary of the definitions. So you either in type 3, you can get a transcript or report card with sufficient credit hours that show the participant is meeting the state standards. For type 4, you need a progress report of satisfactory or better towards established milestones. For example, completing OJT or completion of 1 year of apprenticeship or similar milestones for an employer or training provider. Now, Adult Ed doesn't really have these, so those are written for labor. But and we'll get back to this in a minute. But you need to think about what those milestones might be, and that's one of the tricks here, to develop the appropriate milestones for your type of service and type of participant in partnership with your employer. And the fifth type from the definition, it's a successful passage of an exam required for a particular occupation, or progress in attaining the skills, technical or occupational skills, related to trade benchmarks, such as knowledge-based exams. So there's a lot in there, and we're going to try to unpack those in the time we have a little bit. So first, let's go to the next slide, which talks about how do you validate these. And again, there's some guidance, not a lot of detail, but there is guidance in Program Memorandum 19.1. So let's go through those. The first one being, let's look at transcripts. And again, this is taken straight out of the guidance. And we're going to focus on post-secondary transcript here, since it's typically what would be done with workplace education and IET. It would be a transcript report card from a post-secondary education provider. And the participant needs to have completed at least 12 hours per semester, or if it's part-time, 6 over 12 over the course of 2 semesters during the year, and it must show that the participant is meeting the state's academic standards. Okay, so that's the transcript. It's essentially what you're going to get from a post-secondary provider. That's going to show the course. It has to have the number of hours. It has to meet the state's academic standards. Those are the requirements in the for validation of that data. The next type is milestones, and again, this is from 17.2 this time. A participant has to have a progress report toward established milestone from the employer or training provider. Progress may include training reports on milestones completed by as the individual masters the job skills. So there's some progression of skills. This would be often used in workplace literacy programs. so there's a need to identify what those milestones are. And there's also an allowance to look at pay increase from newly acquired skills as a indicator for this type of MSG. And then finally, if we look at the third MSG, this is from 19.1 again. This is has a number of things in it. It's first getting an exam that is required for an occupation, or passage of or progress toward achieving occupational skills as evidenced by trade benchmarks. And here are 4 things that are spelled out in 19.1. The results of an exam, documenting of progress, documentation from a training provider employer, and a copy of a credential that's required for the occupation that's examined after passing an exam. So you can get exam results under this one that's related to an occupation and that's required for an occupation, or identify the skills that are needed for a particular trade, and that there's progress toward that through training provider or employer documentation.
And Larry, I just wanted to add something here about, could we go back 1 slide, Mehek, to type 4 and then look at type 5 again?
Sure.
Whoops.
There's 4.
There we go. Okay. So I just wanted to mention that, you know, how does this going to mostly play out in adult education is that a progress report from an employer is going to be one of those more relevant data validation elements for our students who are in a workplace literacy program. And that, you know, we go to the next slide there, Mehek. We're talking about, yeah. So, and I think also then for our students who are in an IT program, this would be probably the most relevant type of data validation, which would, you know, include those occupational benchmarks. So just to sort of give perspective on this, the way it seems to be that it might be playing out most frequently in adult education is that for IET, we'd be looking mostly at this 5th type, and then for our workplace literacy participants, mostly at type 4. Not exclusively, but that's just to sort of give sort of that overview of where things might play out. Okay, go ahead, Larry.
Thanks for that clarification, Jay, and that's a good transition to our next slide, which how then do you do this? I mean, this is the language that's in the memos, the requirements, but of course the real trick to this, or the real work in this, is getting it to work, getting to implement it. So that's what I'd like to spend the rest of our time on, is talking about how we might do that. We're going to hear from a presenter and maybe answer some of your questions to get some examples of how you might do that, or what questions you have doing it. So in looking at the different types, I think that 3 and 5 tend to be the transcript and the exam, perhaps a little more cut and dried. You know, you have the institution will have a transcript if it has one. It should have the coursework that the participant has engaged in, and you'll know from that transcript if the participant succeeded in the course, completed the course, how well they did. And as long as you meet the requirements of time and that it's appropriate to the state's standards, it should be fairly straightforward to get that. Not that it's maybe necessarily easy, but there's not a lot of wiggle room in that. Same thing with an exam, which is from type 5. If you're using an occupational exam, when you establish your partnership with your provider, with your IET, the other agencies doing the other parts of the IET, you will probably have identified an exam that's related to the occupation. I don't know, this picture is a culinary exam. I don't know if there is one, but if there were, I know there's a lot of occupations that have exams to pass. So then that's, again, I think a more cut and dried. You set up the partnership, you identify the occupations. If there's exams associated with them, you can then establish that as a type of to demonstrate a type of MSG. as long as it's required for the specific occupation, and then collect that data when the student passes or takes the exam, passes it or not. So I think those two types are a little bit more cut and dry. But if you look at the next slide, we're going to talk a little more about, as Jay referenced, some of the other types that are not as cut and dried, which is really related to milestone under tag 4, and the demonstration of progress, which is type 5, part of type 5. So these are probably, particularly reports about milestones are likely to be very common in workplace literacy. A lot of times for IET, you have occupational benchmarks that are related to an occupation. So those might be what you would use for IET. For workplace literacy, you're going to have to probably establish milestones related to what the curriculum is and what's being taught in that. And they will probably be the type that you would want to use for demonstrating progress here. There's not going to be an occupational exam necessarily, and there's not going to necessarily be career benchmarks, occupational benchmarks, but there will be milestones you might be able to develop for workplace literacy providers. But both of these are more challenging, not as cut and dried, as I say, as our transcripts and exams. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that you might do it. I'd like to hear from some of you about how you might do it and answer your questions. But before that, we're happy to have Marilyn Pizzulo from Indiana, who is going to talk about the approach they use, particularly for their IET partners. So I'm going to turn it over to Marilyn, and she's going to give you a short presentation of the Indiana experience. So Marilyn, you can take it away.
Thank you, Larry.
Unmute. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you. I see you too.
Okay. Larry's done a great job, as of today, explaining the expanded MSG measures for IET and workforce classes. Like you, I was both anxious and excited about the new MSG measures, excited that students and programs would have additional opportunities to show progress, but anxious about how we implement these measures without creating the Wild West in the field and in our data systems. This afternoon, I'm going to share Indiana's approach to implementing these new measures, but let me begin by saying we're a little conservative, and so we kind of structure what it is that we're going to allow our programs to report, and you'll see that as we go a little bit further on in the presentation. But before we get started, let me share a few key facts about Indiana adult education that I think are relevant to the conversation. Next slide, please. So Indiana rolled out IET programming 4 years ago as a part of WIOA implementation, and it did initially 10% of all of our adult education funding was allocated to this service. Over time, and due to some state legislation changes, this was increased to 25% and included services that benefit employers. So as a result of that, and as a student recruitment tool, Workforce Education Initiative, or WEI, was developed in Indiana, and that's our version of workplace literacy. Last year, as you can see, we had in IET, we had 223 classes with close to 2,900 enrollments. And in our Workforce Education Initiative, we had 115 classes with close to 1,500 enrollments. As I share how we are implementing these new measures, remember that Title II in Indiana is housed in the Department of Workforce Development, and I think that that's really important. So we serve alongside WIOA Title I and Title III. The other thing I think it's important is to remember that we do have a customized data system, and the name of that system is INTERS. So if you see INTERS throughout this presentation, that's referencing our data system. Next slide. So what I list here is a watered down version of our IET application process. So what we do is we ask the providers Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You're
Okay.
back.
Okay.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah, someone muted me. Maybe I didn't say the right thing. So you can see here, this is our IET process. We formalized this, and this is a very watered down version, but we asked for specific curriculum from the training from our adult education providers that show that integration with a training partner. They also create that class within our data system. The IET application and supporting documents are sent to the state for approval. And those documents include a single set of learning objectives, the funding sources, but most important to our conversation here, the credential that will be earned as a part of that IET. Once approved, the course is activated in our data system, indicating that it's an IET. The approval process is rigorous and includes curriculum, credential, and labor market information review. The IET class designation in the data system is controlled at the state level. So once we activate that in our data system, we track all of the NRS performance outcomes specific to IET as well as credential attainment. So we get class enrollment, class completion, as well as credential attainment for all of our IET students. Because the way the system for IET was built and tied to our eligible training provider list, we have always tracked program completion and credentials for IET classes. So it was a relatively simple process for us to add passage of an occupational exam as an MSG on table 4. Milestones, however, have been a bit more of a, let's call them a speed bump. Next slide. So having an established IET process and the ability to add passage of an occupational exam for credentials, we decided to only add MSG Type 5 for IET classes and focus on implementing MSG Type 4 progress milestones in our workforce WEI classes. So we understood OJT and apprenticeships, but how would we define, how is it they say, similar milestone from an employer or training provider who is providing training? How could we track this for our program participants? And I've already seen some questions come in. I think Terry was one of them, like what is this going to look like? Because Title II is housed with Title I in Indiana, we sought guidance from our state WIOA staff. They provided the exact same definition shown above, along with the PEARL. Not much help. We really needed to understand how this measure was implemented in the field. It was actually a local WIOA service provider who helped our team understand progress milestones and how we might implement them for WEI. Next slide. So we used an OJT type example and walked through how milestones could be developed for WEI class. We determined that we would have to document the specific job skills desired by an employer for specific tasks. We'd have to document deficiencies that needed to be addressed for those students. We would then outline the training that would be provided by AE that would meet those specific skill deficiencies, and have the employer complete an official skills evaluation on each student to document attainment of the desired skills. So seeing this, the AE team realized we could use our current IET process to approve WEI classes with progress milestones. Now, this is still a work in progress, but it was clear to us that employer documentation and verification was key to milestone progression in our WEIs. Next slide. So this should look similar to the IET process we started with in the beginning. An adult education provider will work with the employer to develop curriculum and progress milestones to meet employer needs, and would create that class in our data system. The adult education provider would submit the application and supporting milestone tracking documents signed off by the employer and send that in for approval. Once we approve it, we'll activate the course in Inters, indicating that it's a WEI, and proof of milestone attainment will be kept in student records for monitoring purposes. So we still have a lot of work to do before our 7/1 start date on tracking milestones. This includes developing training and application materials for the field and adding the progress milestone section within our data system. Within Inters, there will be a menu of common milestones that can be selected, as well as the ability to add employer-defined milestones. Now, what that specifically is going to look like is still a work in progress. Next slide. So we know, like Larry explained, that there are more ways to track progress milestones for IET and workforce programming. We're really interested in pre-apprenticeships, for example. But in Indiana, we're going to take a measured approach to implementation, and we'll continue to expand the use of MSG, these new MSG measures, as we continue to understand it better. Larry, that's all I've got. Let me check questions here. And oh, I did, yes, I believe in the chat, you will find we added our application process for IET, WEI, our definitions for IET and WEI, as well as some examples, good and bad, that we're using in Indiana. So you should be able to access that.
Okay, anything else, Marilyn? Thank you very much. Did you, is there any other questions for you? Can you, in the chat box? Let me look here.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to look.
Okay.
So I will add, there's a lot of questions about eligible exams. And what I would say from Indiana's perspective, we have a list of eligible exams. That's something that we work statewide with between our CTE partners and adult education. It's also used for other state-sponsored training. We have requirements around that, and we continue to use the same list of eligible certifications for our IETs.
Okay. And also I wanted to point out that Marilyn had some handouts that if you look in the chat box, Mahek has sent a link on a Google Drive where you can get those handouts. And also when we post this webinar, we will include those there as well. Okay, so next slide. Thank you, Marilyn. And please stay on, and if there's additional questions. Now I'm going to look at the questions and see what we haven't answered yet in the chat box. And if you have any questions, you can either unmute yourself. Or,
there is a question for Marilyn from Megan Wadley in Missouri. She wanted to know your eligible exam list. Marilyn, is your eligible exam list available?
Yeah, Megan, Jay, we're happy to share that. It's posted publicly, and it is updated on an annual basis. So I will, there's some other resources coming down the pike here in just a few minutes, and I'll make sure that that gets posted to that additional site.
Wonderful. You know, thank you so much, Marilyn. I mean, I just want to mention or just sort of point out that, you know, these new MSG types, these types, they're not new. They've been there, but they're new to us in the adult education program. And, you know, we've been tracking them on NRS Table 11 for the IET. participants. And now they're being included on Table 4 and included in the outcomes that count towards performance. And so it is a new, this is new territory for us in adult education. And you know, we have an opportunity over the next year to figure a lot of these things out. This is a step-by-step process. Not everything's going to be answered and solved in this particular webinar, for example. But for that reason, and not just for the reason that I just mentioned, but also the fact that state data systems and maybe state data collection procedures will need to be amended, these new columns are not required this this October, this October 1st when we submit our reports. So you know, we have time to carry these things out, to do the things that Marilyn talked about in terms of making sure that we're tracking these, first of all, tracking these outcomes correctly, and that we have the appropriate or required data validation in place. So, you know, this is the beginning of what I would say is a work in progress for all of us, in a step-by-step process over the next few months in the upcoming year. Go ahead, Larry.
Yes, thanks for pointing that out, Jay, because this is new to us in adult ed for some of us. I know some of you have probably been doing this, and it's evolving. The guidance is general, as you see. It's not that specific. I think intentionally, so that you can do what's best for your providers and with your providers and your students to meet their needs within the confines of the requirements. So we don't have a lot of examples like we typically do, or we haven't answered a lot of the questions because they haven't been posed to us in some of the details of the implementation. So this is one of the reasons we're starting off, as Jay said, this is not that. This is just the beginning, I think, of a dialogue we will have with you as we do with all the other NRS requirements as they're rolled out. So thank you for that, Jay. And let me look at a few of the other questions. Did you have any?
Well, we told Tina we would come back to her question here, and she's got it. That was the very first one that she posted about report cards and transcripts. And I'm really focusing on the end of her question here. She says, can we create our own, quote, report as evidence of satisfactory completion? And, you know, Tina, what I would say is when I think about and go back to the joint data validation guidance, we don't have it up here on the screen, but it lists very specifically the kinds of things that we need to validate the data for this particular MSG type, and it is a report card or it's a transcript. It's not something that's created. So it's very specific in the joint data validation guidance what can be used as validation for this particular MSG type. So I hope that answers your question. Some of these questions, I'm going to say, we might not be able to answer in this webinar. We're in this with you. So, but we'll try to answer as many as we can, and whatever ones we're not able to answer, we'll take back to our team and think about them and get back to you. And also, I would like to invite you, and we don't have that in here, to please send us, if you think about questions after this webinar and you'd like to explore them with us, to send them to nrs@ed.gov, nrs@ed.gov, and we'll take those up. We meet regularly to talk about all kinds of implementation questions when it comes to the NRS. Here's Kelly Zink. Kelly Zink.
Oh, and Jay, just before that, do you? I also want to say I'm going to, at the end of this, I'm going to talk about a forum we're setting up on our NRS course site that will be specifically for that purpose. So you can do it either way. You can send us direct email or and join in the discussion, which I hope you'll participate in as we get it started. So, okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah. And I heard I heard somebody at the beginning of the webinar in the background saying they never leave us enough time for questions at the end of the webinar. And you know, there's just so many to answer, and we'll get to them. We will get to them. We have them all here in the chat. If we don't get to them in this webinar, please be assured that we'll get back to you with an answer or some kind of dialogue with you about this question, so we can help you think it through. Kelly Zink in Oregon asks, post-secondary institutions are on terms or quarters, not semesters. How does that affect the 12 hours per semester? So Kelly, when you look at the joint guidance, and it talks about, and I don't think we have the slide. Can we put the slide up here? I don't know if we can get back to that easily, where we talk about full-time and part-time students. Yeah, we're trying to pull that up here. I think what we're talking about here, if we go back to it.
There you go.
Okay, so we're talking about credit hours. You know, I think in terms of in terms of terms and quarters and not semesters, there is, you know, certainly, I mean, I come from a higher education experience where I worked in higher ed. We know that there are, and by the way, semesters are not always 16 weeks. Sometimes those semesters are much more compressed and much more condensed, particularly these days when universities and colleges are delivering courses in a more condensed, compressed format, and they're doing so online. So I would not get hung up on the terminology of semesters versus quarters versus terms, and I would focus more on the hours, on the credit hours. So I hope that helps to answer your question, and we'll get back to you if we have any, if we find that there's any different way to look at that. And Terry Tackett, he asks, I'm just sort of going through these chronologically. He says, so could or would probably, I'm not, there's a typo there, probably report.
Be self-reported. I think he's asking how to, Terry, you can correct us and jump in here. How would you get these data? And I think, go on, Jay, you can answer, but there is a, I didn't mention it, but there is in one of those memos, program memos, the 5 ways that you can do it. One is just from your database, one's data matching, one is what's called attestation, from an employer. So you can get them from employers, you can, if it's possible to get them through a data match, you can do it. So that's listed. Jay, I can't remember off the top of my head the 5 ways. I can remember like 3 or 4 of them, but
right,
I mean.
yeah.
So
it's hard for me to. So I think, Terry, what you're asking here is the data match versus documentation. I think as long as you're getting the documentation or the elements that are required in the joint guidance to validate a particular MSG type, and you're able to do that either through a data match or you're able to do it through actual documentation that you receive from an employer, then that, I think both of those, as long as I don't have the guidance in front of me. I always go back to the guidance to make sure that, I say me, but that we're getting, that we're actually, getting the actual documentation that we need to validate the MSG type. We're so familiar, aren't we? We're so familiar with educational functioning level gain, with that first, with the MSG type and with high school diploma, but these types here are something that we're going to be looking at as time goes, in the next months and in the year, to sort of understand how is it that we can get these things. And like Marilyn said in her presentation, she asked her WIOA partners how they do it. And I would recommend to anyone here on the call that you do that, that you talk to your WIOA partners to see if there is documentation or a piece of data validation that's relevant. For example, that's something that would be relevant to, for example, an adult education workplace literacy program, or relevant to an IET program, such as those we talked about, the occupational benchmarks. You know, talking to your partners about how do they obtain the documents to validate the data. Jenna Kelly, she asks, will workplace readiness exams count as knowledge-based exams? Jenna, I'm not able to answer that question just off the top here. I don't want to give a wrong answer. Oh, hold on, here we go. Yeah, maybe we can get back to that slide. I would need to in order to answer this question, very carefully read the joint guidance, and also, yeah, I think it's an exam. I'm sorry, I'm looking at a slide here. Hold on, let's go to
back to the previous slide, Mike.
Passage of, okay, occupational exams. I think, Jenna, what we'll do is talk to you offline about that. I would need in front of me the actual wording from the joint guidance in order to answer that question.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
It's hard. Oh, hi Cheryl.
Yeah, it's Cheryl. Yeah. So I just would point out on that one that the exam has to be occupation specific. So if you're running an IET program, that program has to have an occupational training component. It's not a general workforce readiness. It has to have a occupational focus, and the exam has to be occupation specific. So there's questions in here generally about safe serve, and there's questions in here about workforce readiness. The lens has to be that it's an occupation specific exam to meet trade benchmarks. So you need to look at it through that lens. I would say generally workforce readiness would not do it. I don't know that safe serve would or would not.
Yeah, that was my inclination as well. And yeah, thank you, Cheryl, for clarifying that.
Yeah, and I would add, having looked just recently, like today, looked at the documentation, it's all over it that it has to be, as Cheryl said, related to an occupation, required for an occupation, be tied to industry benchmarks. So it can't really be a general workplace exam. It has to be tied to something specific related to the occupational training.
Right.
That is being delivered in that IET program.
Right, that's being delivered
yes.
during the training, the participants training program, yes.
Yeah.
So that's the answer to those two questions here.
Okay, so there you got the question. The answer to Megan Wadley's question: what exams count? I think we had just addressed that.
And Tina as well.
Tina talks about, okay, she's talking about exams as well. Yep. Megan has a question. Same question on milestones. Is there guidance to determine what experiences count? Pre-apprenticeship, registered apprenticeship, etc.
Sure, I can take that one too, Jay.
Yeah, go ahead.
What I would say is your lens that you need to look at it here is does that program constitute an IET? Not all pre-apprenticeship programs are IET programs, and I don't know that registered apprenticeship programs are IET programs either. This provision only applies to IET participants, and IET is very, very specifically defined. So like Marilyn talked about, she has a whole process to approve that as an IET program. So if somebody's doing a pre-apprenticeship program, that could be an IET or could not be an IET, but you have to know it's an IET to count the participant under the milestone.
Right, that's the key. Okay, Kathy Olson-Tracy, is this retroactive for program year 20 and 2021? Yes, it is, Kathy. You can count, and what you're talking about when you say PY 20, 20, and 21, that's the program year that we are in right now, and that we will be submitting performance reports for this coming fall, October 1st, when they're due. So yes, this is, you might call it retroactive, but it's effective. It's not required, but if you can, you're certainly on table 4 this fall, we'll have the opportunity to report these additional measurable skill gain types for in columns G and N, the new columns on table 4, for this program year that we are in right now.
And Jay, Nancy asked in a related question, will these count in the performance targets for 2021? Your MSG target, if these new additions for work.
Oh, you're talking about, Nancy is asking whether or not, if they report it this fall, will it be counted as actual performance against the targets that were set for this particular program year? Yes.
I think so. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Nancy, if I'm wrong, please cut in.
Yes. Yes, Nancy, if that's your question, yes. If you use these columns, these new columns this fall to report on these additional MSG types that are occurring in this program year, yes, that will count towards your overall performance for measurable skill gain on that table. Shannon Stang asks, do apprenticeships, internships have to be paid? I don't think so.
Again, I'd say, I don't know that an apprenticeship or an internship is an IET program.
Right.
This has to be an IET program. It has to be a bona fide IET program that you recognize as an IET program in your state. The payment of an apprenticeship, I don't think is, I don't know that that's relevant to how you count accountability. If it's an IET program and it includes some kind of apprenticeship component, it doesn't matter if it's paid or not paid. But again, I am not aware of apprenticeship models that are IETs. I'm aware of pre-apprenticeship models that are IETs, but I'm not aware of apprenticeship ones. Not that they don't exist. So again, your lens is this an IET program?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you know, the confusion, why we have so much confusion is a lot of the guidance is written from a labor lens, and of course we are different in adult ed. So for example, this whole issue of apprenticeships. We are just about out of time. I think there's just a couple of questions before, if you need to go off, I think we could probably answer them if you want to stay on. I think I see only a couple of questions. And as I said, if you want to send your question to, as Jay said, nrsweb.org, you can do that, or send it, of course, to one of us. And just to go to the heck, if you can just go down to the next to last slide. Just want to tell everybody about next one and next one. Yeah. As I said, I'm going to set up a forum on the NRS website. I will email that out. You'll get an email from our NRS mailing list about a forum I'm setting up to talk about this, ask your questions, post resources you might have. I'm going to put Marilyn's on there. I see Anson offered some as well. Anson Green is listening in, and I will put his resources up there. And if you want to go on, ask questions, see what your peers are doing, share your approaches, you'll be hearing about that either today or tomorrow. I'll send an email out. You'll just go on and register, and you'll be able to do that. So that concludes. I know we're past our time. Do you, Jay, do you want to, if anybody wants to stay around, we'll maybe answer.
Well, I think once again, just want to thank Marilyn for stepping in here to help us understand from a state perspective how this is implemented and how she's implementing it, she and her team in Indiana. So again, thank you very much, Marilyn, for sharing that with us. And any of the questions that we didn't get to today, we'll follow up with you individually to make sure that we address those. I think we should be able to save these from the chat. Is that right, Larry?
Yeah, I'll save them, and I'll send you the ones that there's only 3 or 4 that we haven't answered. And
right.
I'll send them to you, and we'll answer you your question. And again, if you have more, email us, or any one of us, Jay, me, or Alan, or to nrs@ar.org or the forum. So there will be lots of opportunity. This was just the beginning. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Marilyn, especially, and for all of you for your contributions and attention. And I hope we'll be hearing from you soon. So have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.